The Outer Worlds 2 is here, and we're looking at another Unreal Engine title on PC, one of so many this year. In today's video, I will simply be going over the optimized settings and what PC you will need to play this game with fluid frame rates. So let's get started in this video where the game begins, the first time it is loaded up. I was happy to see that the game on first boot has a semi-lengthy shader pre-compilation step. On a Ryzen 5 3600, this took roughly 6.5 minutes, and on a Ryzen 7 9800X3D, it completed in 3.5 minutes. I take this usually as a good sign, as that means the developers spent the time collecting and dedicating time to crunching game-relevant shaders. These days, a longer shader compilation step tends to mean better frame times and no large stutters while playing the game. So how are the frame times and the CPU performance in The Outer Worlds 2 based upon that? Well, getting in game for the first time on that Ryzen 5 3600, I was initially kind of worried, as the opening cutscene with the talking head person on a tablet screen had some larger stutters in it, both on that 3600 and on the 9800X3D. That was a less than positive first impression, honestly. Rerunning the cutscene again, though, showed that the second time playing the cutscene did not showcase frame time issues. And if I deleted the shader cache in Windows and let the game pre-compile again, that saw the shader stutters returning. That means, bizarrely, that the game does miss obvious shaders in its opening seconds in spite of having multiple minute-long pre-compilation. I think that is bad priorities on the side of the developers, but it does not ruin the full game, of course. Playing into the game further, the game's intro sequence beyond that had zero compilation-related stutter. In fact, it has no stutter at all. The intro chapter was incredibly smooth on a Ryzen 5 3600, paired with an RTX 4060 at more or less medium settings with high view distance, which is what the game defaulted to on this PC. And that was all at 1440p DLSS balance mode. Beyond the initial jump scare in the opening cutscene, the intro chapter to the game offers good first impressions for performance, although I will say they are actually quite deceptive as to what the game's real performance profile is. This initial area is almost fully linear, while the rest of the game is actually made up of semi-open world larger maps with much more AI. So how do those areas run? Well, after the game's initial intro chapter, you land back on your ship and you can choose to ferry off to your first planet, Eden. And that is when things kind of went sour on this lower end PC configuration with the Ryzen 5 3600. One reason for the experience souring is down to the way the game uses asynchronous shader compilation. You can see this in the initial cutscene when going down planet side. The Ryzen 5 3600 is being hammered here and the frame rate is dropping. And there is a lot of pop-in in the game's visuals as the game is using visibility skipping with its async shader compilation, causing objects to load in later only after their shader is ready. Comparing the first time I went down to the planet with me doing that again a second time on the right, we can see that the game runs faster and better the second time around while looking more visually stable with no pop-in. I hate that I have to reiterate this after the Silent Hill F video, but honestly this is not how a title should use async shader compilation. This is a sequence that happens less than 30 minutes into the game, arguably, and every player has to see it, so it really should be included in the pre-compilation step. Async shader comp really should not be used for things everyone sees. Rather, they should be used for shaders that are harder to collect, that you do not see as soon as you start playing a game. The shader comp was already 6 minutes long or so on this Ryzen 5 3600, so another few seconds really wouldn't hurt the player if it meant preventing pop-in and preventing a bad first-time experience in a scene that is supposed to be visually arresting and cinematic. But I digress. Running through the first planet terrain after the cutscene on the 3600 shows that the game is heavy on low-end CPUs. One reason is, of course, because we're looking at a UE5 open world title here, and the other is due to its async shader compilation, which on the first run through a world keeps popping up as you see new things. There's moments where the frame times are worse and the CPU goes to near 100% due to async shader comp, and that won't happen the second time you run through an area. Basically, the first time you run through a planet, the worse it'll run than later on. I can only presume this happens each time you visit a new area or a new planet in the game. I really wish developers would consider optionally longer shader pre-comp times for lower end CPUs. Beyond asynchronous shader compilation though, the game is heavy on low end CPUs like this regardless. Here's me running through the world at roughly medium settings on that 3600 paired with a big GPU. Here I am CPU limited the entire time in this footage. This is the second run on the planet where no asynchronous shader compilation is occurring, and performance is still in the lower 40s, and it's often enough in the lower 40s, and I'm almost never at 60 FPS, so a CPU like this at these settings is not good enough. One positive note that I have to say here is that the frame times are at least okay enough and generally steady while CPU limited at least, minus those areas where world partition boundaries are found, and those always cause repeatable spikes on every CPU. You can see those periodically on the frame time graph here. Dropping settings to low, as we can see on the left, from mostly medium, as we can see on the right, now the game averages around 4% better performance, but the worst running areas can be in the upper 40s, while they were in the lower 40s on medium. This means that even on the lowest preset, the Ryzen 5 3600 will not provide a steady 60 FPS in this title in its open world, and it is actually constantly below 60 FPS even on the lowest settings. Given this type of CPU burden, a more consistent 60 FPS is going to require a far better CPU. Put up against one of the best, the Ryzen 7 9800X3D, that CPU manages to perform on average 280% faster in this benchmark run here, and probably could perform even better in total if the 5090 was not limiting its top-end performance. Yep, I'm actually GPU limited a couple of times in this benchmark here. That is an incredible performance difference and one of the highest I have ever measured on this channel between these two CPUs, so that 3D V-Cache must be working overtime in this title. The frame timeline is also a lot smoother, as you may notice, and it will offer a world's better experience. But world partition lines still cause frame time spikes on the 9800X3D, though they are proportionately smaller than those on the 3600, at their worst being around 16 milliseconds in length or so. So you will get a better experience on a much bigger CPU in this game, but even the medium settings with software ray tracing, as we see here, will still sometimes show frame time oddness here or there. Based on a third comparison here with a Ryzen 7 3700X, which has 2 cores and 4 more threads than the Ryzen 5 3600, that only ran 3% better on average than the Ryzen 5 3600. That means this game scales more with linear processor speed than it does with more cores. That 3700X still has troublesome frame times. To me, this means you will need at least a Ryzen 5600 or 5800 processor here to maintain decent performance in the open world. But even then, you'll have to keep your expectations in check, as something like a 5950X, which I've tested here, only runs about 17% faster than the Ryzen 5 3600. And if you look at the frame time graph as I'm traversing through the denser areas of the world, you will see issues with it having spiky frame times in such moments, so it still does actually drop below 60 FPS. Really, it looks like you'll need an X3D processor of some sort in this game to have much flatter frame times and at all have a chance at achieving a high frame rate experience without any sort of frame generation.
Ask them defectors if they miss anything about Protectorate life.
10 bits, they said community.
Yep. Community.
Getting into the graphical settings for Optimised Settings, primarily for the GPU, your first port of call needs to be the option to select or deselect hardware ray tracing. Now, normally in a UE5 game, this would toggle Lumen's hardware ray tracing path, giving you higher quality reflections and better in-diffuse direct lighting for a cost. In this game's case, that is true. For minimal GPU cost on an RTX 4060 at native res 1440p, you can get much better reflection quality using triangles instead of blobby SDFs. They'll include dynamic objects and give you more stability, with less noise on them due to accurate traces, as we can see here, 6% on the GPU in this scene. For diffuse lighting, the difference can be more subtle, but as we can see here, you can get more accurate bounce lighting with more red lighting hitting adjacent geometry here in this scene. And on the very high setting, it is common actually to see the hardware path being faster, as we see here. Now, this would all be quite excellent, and I'd recommend to turn it on for higher end GPUs, but your CPU would need to be up to snuff. As we can see here, when CPU limited, the Ryzen 5 3600 is 25% slower with the hardware ray tracing path on. So you'd have to sacrifice quite a lot of CPU performance for that accuracy. So it really would only be for beefier CPUs at that point. Now that would be the case were not for one issue. Let us read the description of this option again. It enables real-time ray tracing for more realistic lighting, shadows, and reflections. Wait, shadows? Ray trace shadows? Yes, this option also turns on ray tracing for local light shadows, not from the sun or moon, and that unfortunately makes the setting kind of worse because the ray trace shadows are problematic. Let me give you some examples. In this scene here, for example, having hardware RT on leaves this shadow looking incredibly grainy and wrong, while the virtual shadow maps on the left look so smooth and stable on very high. It also runs better on the left while looking better. It looks like the local RT light shadows with that hardware RT option seem to lack any and all good denoising. So all those environments with penumbra shadows are just stippled and messy. I have a hard time imagining this is intended, but I tried it on 3 separate PCs, and that is the case visually here. Another reason why this option is kind of bad is because the game is using lumen fallback geometry for these local RT shadows, and lumen fallback geometry is missing tons of detail on objects that the VSM version will have. Like here, notice the missing shadows on the right hand side. The cables are not casting a shadow on the wall anymore, and the shadow underneath the cables that you can see on the right hand side is completely incorrect because it's only done in screen space now, while on the left with VSMs you're going to get full coverage. Using that low poly lumen geometry for direct shadows is honestly not a very good idea, and it will cause often issues like this throughout the entire experience. So I'm kind of confused why this option exists at the moment as it does. If the hardware RT option in the menus just toggled hardware lumen, I would be thrilled, but at the moment it also forcibly turns on these visually poor hardware RT shadows that are just grainy and missing objects, like here where they turn off all the individual lights in the intro scene of the game. Till this is patched and made a separate setting in the options, I do not recommend anyone use the hardware RT option here. Regarding software lumen though, mid to low spec GPUs will want to lower that setting. As we can see here, there is an immense performance difference between very high and high or medium, a 66% performance improvement going down to high and a near 100% improvement going down to medium. That is frankly absurd for such a small visual difference in many scenes. Now, usually for optimized settings, I would say use medium here, but here I recommend both high and low optimized settings. Use the high setting, as the medium setting in the open world sections of the game can show quite a lot of flickering of ambient occlusion on the grass, so definitely use the high setting here in spite of it being a bit heavier. For the reflections, the main difference is found in reflection resolution, being almost quarter res looking at high and medium, and improving performance by 12% on the 4060 in this scene here. You can also see it trace less accurately, with a 5% performance uplift on medium and high, as we see here, though that more accurate tracing on the very high setting has a lot of noise in it. Lumen denoiser is definitely kind of low quality. Here I would recommend the 4070 level GPUs go for very high in spite of that, while lower end GPUs just set this to high to cash in on that better performance. Next option to look out for is shadow quality, which controls VSM quality, and this has an immense performance implication. For directional shadows from the sun or moon, as we can see here, you can improve performance by 74% going down to high and by 85% by going down to medium. And visually, the difference in such a scene would look incredibly minor. You can only really see that the VSM resolution is higher, so its stair steps are smaller, but it's reducing performance that much, and it's kind of unreasonable. And it's still imperfect due to using rasterization and having stair steps. For a more diffuse penumbra shadow, like from the sun or the moon, the difference will be even smaller. Here, there is scarcely a difference between medium and very high in spite of the performance improvement. Only low shadows turn off the denoising and look kind of unviable actually. So you might be thinking medium is the best bet for optimized settings, but looking at indoor lights makes that a tricky proposition. As we can see here, indoor local lights have the biggest visual difference between the settings. On very high, they have the resolution increase I talked about earlier, but most importantly, they have denoising on, so they are much cleaner shadows as a result, with far less noise in them. On medium, penumbra shadows seem to be disabled altogether, while denoising is still off, so it decreases the quality further, and once again, low looks kind of bad. Here in a scene like this, the sacrifice going down to high or medium is palpable, but very high is still super costly. The biggest issue with the shadow setting though is how it interacts with image reconstruction. Basically anything below very high has issues with the game's image reconstruction, causing a lot of noise on all the image reconstruction options you can use. So if you are upscaling, the game's shadows can look quite grainy at times. I would say FSR 3 and DLSS look arguably the worst here. The only way to make it look better is by utilizing the very high setting and putting up with its higher cost and kind of negating the advantage of using image upscaling. Given how low-end GPUs will be using image reconstruction here in general, this is quite a hard option to optimize for. In my opinion, I will split the settings here, unfortunately, and leave it up to you. If you just want raw performance and don't mind noise, use medium. But if you find noise distracting and you are using image reconstruction, then you have to use that very high setting. The other settings deserve less consideration as they have less of an effect on performance. Looking at the foliage quality, this option increases the amount of scattered foliage in the open world terrain of the game, with it looking noticeably sparse on the low setting. Here, given the smaller FPS loss from this setting, I recommend low-end GPUs go for high, and 4070 and above GPUs go for very high. View distance somewhat confusingly adjusts the amount of vegetation drawn in the distance usually, with little change from very high to high, but with a more visible loss to vegetation in the far field at medium and obvious cuts at low. Here I recommend low-end GPUs go for high, while 4070 and above GPUs aim for very high. The last setting that deserves mention is texture quality. Now, unlike some other Unreal Engine games, I've yet to measure any meaningful performance consequences for this being at very high on an 8GB GPU, even at native 1440p with software RT on. At least in a benchmark, there weren't added in-frame time spikes. That does not mean they are not there though, it's just hard to find them perhaps. I did notice though the lowered anisotropic filtering quality on world textures at the lowest settings. The setting also does not seem to aid the quality of textures that are already lower quality in general, even when set to very high. Here as a precaution, I will recommend very high textures for 12GB GPUs and medium textures for 8GB GPUs. With that being said, these are our various optimized settings. Some usual Unreal Engine tucks here in regards to reflections and GI quality, but with more caution added there for the shadow setting, which can look a bit odd at medium indoors at times. It's your choice. In total, in an outdoor scene, optimized settings at native 1440p DLAA on an RTX 4060 can increase performance by 106%. And honestly, in a scene like this, I think you will struggle to see any sort of difference in almost anything other than grass. But here in the middle, I included an optimized low settings with the shadows set to very high for reasons that I mentioned earlier. And even with that setup, we still get a 53% performance uplift in this scene. Indoors are where shadow settings are more obvious, and optimized low settings there with medium shadows can increase performance by 119%. And beyond issues with some penumbra shadows, you would have trouble noticing the difference. But for those troublesome shadows with noise, the very high option here in the middle still increases indoor performance by 67%. So you can have incredible performance wins on the GPU in this game without losing too much quality. Using low optimized settings on an RTX 4060 with medium shadows at 1440p DLSS 4 balance mode, I saw typical areas in the open world on the first planet being above 60 FPS even while in combat, which felt good on the mouse with little issue. Only the more dense, built-up town area in the game would challenge the GPU more, at worst bringing it down to just around 50 FPS. So within a good VRR window as I see it, that is presuming your CPU is up to the task in keeping the game having those clean frame times.
Am I going to need to find a truck?
You certainly can have mine.
And with that being said, I'm at the end of this video here. The game is alright on PC, but makes some questionable technical decisions here or there. Asynchronous shader compilation should not be used as this title uses it. It needs a longer pre-compilation time there for lower end CPUs. Likewise, the hardware ray tracing option is a big miss in its current form. The added in ray trace shadows are just too low quality to even want them, even if the reflections and indirect lighting look better. The developer ought to make the ray traced shadows a separate option. Likewise, they need to fix denoising from them. For some reason, the denoising seems to work better when RT shadows are set to low. What's that all about? Anyway, like, subscribe, ring the bell, help us out on Patreon, and as always, this is Alex bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.
It's an embarrassing miscalculation on my part is what it is.